Rain hammered against the glass, drowning out the wail of distant sirens. Most people would have locked their doors. Most people wouldn't have looked twice at the shadow slumped against the porch railing. But she opened the door. She dragged a dying man across her threshold, trading her quiet, ordinary life for a target on her back. By dawn, the local police wouldn't be her problem. 200 black SUVs would be idling in her driveway, and the man bleeding on her rug would be the one giving the orders. The porch light flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the wet wood. Inside, Chloe sat at her kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The clock on the microwave read 2:14 a.m. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, beating a relentless rhythm against the aluminum siding of her isolated cabin. It was the kind of storm that made the bones ache, the kind that washed out the dirt roads leading back to town. Chloe didn't mind the isolation. After 4 years as an EMT in a city that chewed people up and spat them out in the emergency room waiting area, silence was a luxury she willingly paid for. A sharp, heavy thud hit the front door. Chloe froze. The mug stopped halfway to her lips. She listened. The wind howled, rattling the window panes, but beneath it there was a scratching sound. Like boots dragging across the decking, she set the mug down silently. She didn't call out. Living 10 miles out of town taught you that whoever was knocking at 2 a.m. wasn't selling cookies. She moved to the entryway, her bare feet silent on the linoleum, and pressed her eye to the peephole. Nothing, just the sheets of rain and the darkness of the tree line. Then a groan, low, wet, and decidedly human. Chloe hesitated. The cynical, self-preserving part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive through foster care and a decade of navigating the worst neighborhoods on ambulance duty, screamed at her to walk away, turn off the lights, go to bed. But old habits died hard. She unbolted the door and cracked it open, leaving the chain engaged. The wind whipped rain into her face. She looked down. A man lay curled against the doorframe. His dark hair was plastered to his skull and his expensive wool coat was soaked through, heavy with mud. He had one hand pressed hard against his lower abdomen. Even in the dim porch light, Chloe could see the dark, shiny substance seeping between his fingers, mixing with the puddles on the wood. He lifted his head. His face was pale, his jaw locked in a rigid line of agony. Eyes the color of bruised steel locked onto hers. "Help," he ground out. The word didn't sound like a plea. It sounded like an order from a man who was entirely unaccustomed to asking for anything. In the distance, barely audible over the storm, the high-pitched wail of police sirens cut through the night. They were miles away, but they were coming down the county road. Her road. Chloe looked at the man. She looked at the blood. She thought about the corrupt local sheriff's department, the kind of cops who shot first and planted evidence later. Whoever this guy was, if they found him here, he wouldn't make it to a jail cell. "You're making a mistake, Chloe," she muttered to herself. She slammed the door shut, unhooked the chain, and threw it open wide. Stepping out into the freezing rain, she grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined coat. He was heavy, dead weight. "Get up!" she hissed, hauling him upward. "I can't carry you, you have to push!" He grunted, his boots finding meager purchase on the slick wood. Together, they stumbled over the threshold. Chloe kicked the door shut with her heel, throwing the deadbolt just as the distant blue and red lights painted the tops of the pine trees down the hill. The man collapsed onto her living room rug, taking Chloe down with him. She scrambled back, breathless, rain dripping from her eyelashes. He rolled onto his back, gasping. His coat fell open. The white button-down shirt underneath was a saturated, ruined mess. He wasn't just bleeding, he was hemorrhaging. Chloe scrambled to her feet, moving purely on muscle memory. "Don't move. Keep your hand on it." She ran to the bathroom and dragged out her trauma kit. A heavy red duffel she had liberated from the hospital years ago. By the time she dropped to her knees beside him on the rug, his eyes were rolling back. "Hey, Hey! She slapped his cheek. Not a gentle tap, but a sharp, stinging blow. His eyes snapped back into focus, flashing with sudden, violent anger. His hand shot out, catching her wrist in a grip that felt like a steel vise. Even half dead, the man was dangerously strong. "Touch me again," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp, "and I'll break your arm." Chloe didn't flinch. She leaned in, her face inches from his. "Let go of my wrist or I'm going to let you bleed out on my Persian rug. And it's a fake Persian, so I don't really care if it gets ruined. Your choice." For a long second, they stared at each other. The house was silent, except for the drumming rain and his ragged breathing. Slowly, the grip on her wrist loosened. His hand fell back to his side. "Good choice," Chloe said flatly. She pulled a pair of heavy shears from her kit and began to cut away his shirt. The wound was ugly. A small, puckered entry hole on his right flank, just below the ribs. No exit wound. The bullet was still in there. The surrounding skin was already bruising, an angry purple and black starburst against his pale skin. Chloe swore under her breath. "Who shot you?" "Does it matter?" he rasped, his eyes glued to the ceiling. "It matters if they're coming up my driveway to finish the job. They're not." He winced as she pressed a thick pad of gauze directly over the hole, applying her full body weight to it. A harsh, animalistic sound tore from his throat. "Sorry," she lied. "I need to stop the bleeding before I can do anything else. Who are you hiding from?" "The cops." "The police," he choked out, struggling to breathe through the pain, "are the least of my concerns." Chloe held the pressure for 5 agonizing minutes. The smell of copper filled the small room, thick and metallic, mixing with the scent of wet wool and expensive cedar cologne. The man under her hands was shivering violently now. Shock was setting in. "I'm Chloe," she said, trying to keep his brain engaged. "Since you're bleeding all over my floor, the least you can do is give me a name." "Dante." "Just Dante. Just Dante. All right, just Dante. I'm going to have to dig this out. If I leave it, it's going to get infected, and you'll die in a few days instead of tonight. I don't have anesthesia. I have a bottle of cheap whiskey and a leather belt. Take your pick." Dante turned his head to look at her. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating assessment. He was looking at her not as a savior, but as an asset, gauging her competence. "Do it," he said. Chloe didn't bother with the whiskey. She didn't want him vomiting while he lay on his back. She sanitized her instruments, forceps, a scalpel, a heavy needle, and poured iodine straight into the wound. Dante didn't scream. He bit down on the insides of his cheek until blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, his hands gripping the edges of the rug so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The procedure was brutal, messy, and decidedly unromantic. There was no gentle mopping of his brow. There was only the slick slip of blood, the sickening squelch of metal probing torn muscle, and the heavy, ragged breathing of 2 people fighting a desperate battle against biology. "Got it," Chloe grunted, her forceps clamping down on something hard. She pulled. A deformed piece of lead dropped into a metal bowl with a loud clink. Dante let out a long, shuddering breath and let his head loll to the side. "You're surprisingly proficient." "I was an EMT." She began packing the wound and preparing the sutures. "Was?" "Burned out. Too many gunshot wounds." She threaded the needle. "Hold still. This is going to suck." She worked quickly, her hands steady. Despite the adrenaline crash she could feel hovering on the horizon. Every time the needle pierced his skin, Dante's muscles twitched, but he didn't make a sound. He just watched her. "Why did you open the door, Chloe?" he asked softly. The edge in his voice was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity. "Temporary insanity," she muttered, tying off a knot. "You heard the sirens." "I did." "So you harbour fugitives often?" "You're my first. Don't let it go to your head." She snipped the thread and wiped down the surrounding skin. She taped a heavy bandage over the neat row of black stitches. "You're lucky. It missed everything vital. You'll live, assuming you don't tear these open." Chloe rocked back on her heels, finally taking a good look at him. Stripped of the muddy coat and the ruined shirt, he looked less like a victim and more like a predator temporarily confined to a cage. His chest was covered in faded, intricate scars, knife wounds, burns, older bullet holes. He was a man composed entirely of violence. She had just stitched up a monster. Dante caught her staring. A slow, dark smile touched his lips, not quite reaching his eyes. Regretting your temporary insanity yet? Immensely, Chloe said, standing up. Her knees popped. She gathered the bloody towels and the metal bowl. I'm making coffee. Don't bleed on anything else. I'll try to contain myself. She walked into the kitchen, dropping the ruined materials into the sink. She leaned her weight against the counter, closing her eyes. Her hands were shaking now. The reality of what she had done was settling in, aiding and abetting, tampering with evidence. She turned on the faucet, scrubbing the blood from under her fingernails. When she walked back into the living room with 2 mugs of black coffee, Dante was sitting up, leaning heavily against the sofa. He had found a throw blanket and draped it over his shoulders. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp. They tracked her every movement. She handed him a mug. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was ice cold. Thank you, he said. Chloe sat in the armchair opposite him, pulling her knees to her chest. Don't thank me yet. The storm is going to break by morning. When it does, you have to leave. I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here. Understood, Dante said, taking a slow sip of the scalding coffee. May I use your phone? Mine didn't survive the fall into the ravine. Chloe pointed to the ancient landline mounted on the kitchen wall. Help yourself, assuming the lines aren't down. Dante pushed himself up. It took him a full minute to get to his feet, his face draining of whatever color it had managed to regain. He limped to the kitchen. Chloe watched him punch in a series of numbers from memory. He didn't speak immediately, he just waited. Then, in a voice entirely different from the one he had used with her, a voice devoid of pain, devoid of warmth, absolute in its authority, he spoke a single sentence in a language she didn't understand. Italian? Russian? She couldn't tell. He hung up the phone and limped back to the living room. Your ride coming? She asked. They are. Good. Chloe took a sip of her coffee. It tasted like ash. Then we wait. The hours crawled by. The storm finally blew itself out around 5 a.m., leaving behind a profound, dripping silence. The grey light of pre-dawn began to filter through the blinds, painting the living room in cold, bruised tones. Chloe hadn't slept. She sat in the armchair, her eyes fixed on Dante. He had fallen into a fitful doze on the floor, his breathing shallow but even. As the light grew, she began to notice the details she had missed in the chaos of the night. The expensive watch on his left wrist, a Patek Philippe, easily worth more than her house. The custom stitching on his ruined trousers. This wasn't some street-level thug who got lucky in a gang shootout. This was someone high up the food chain. Chloe stood up, her joints stiff. She walked to the window and cracked the blinds. The rain had turned her long dirt driveway into a muddy swamp. The pine trees dripped steadily. It was quiet, too quiet. Then she felt it. Before she heard the engines, she felt a low vibration in the floorboards. It started as a hum, a barely perceptible trembling in the wood that slowly built into a steady, ominous rumble. Chloe frowned. She looked out the window again, squinting through the mist rolling off the wet ground. Through the trees, at the very end of her mile-long driveway, headlights pierced the fog. Not one set, not two. A procession, a massive, imposing fleet of identical matte black SUVs was turning off the main county road, winding their way up her private drive. The lead vehicle crept forward like a stalking panther, its heavy armoured chassis eating up the muddy terrain without a slip. Behind it came another, and another. Chloe stopped breathing. She counted 10, then 20. The line snaked back through the woods, stretching out to the main road, endless and terrifying. What did I do? Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her cynical exterior. She turned back to the living room. Dante was awake. He was standing. He had discarded the blood-soaked throw blanket. Despite his bare chest, the heavy bandage, and his pale skin, he didn't look like a wounded stray anymore. The shift in his posture was subtle, but absolute. His spine was straight. His chin was lifted. He was looking out the window, watching the arrival of his army. "I told them to be discreet," Dante murmured, his tone mildly irritated. "Discreet?" Chloe choked out, her voice tight. "There's a literal convoy in my yard. Who are you?" Dante turned to look at her. The bruised steel eyes were calm. "I told you, Dante." The lead SUV rolled to a halt just inches from her porch steps. The engine idled with a heavy, menacing purr. The doors opened in unison. Men stepped out. Dozens of them. They wore tailored black suits, dark ties, and earpieces. They didn't look like mobsters from a movie. They looked like corporate security, highly trained, heavily armed, and entirely lethal. They spread out, securing the perimeter of her tiny cabin in seconds, their eyes scanning the woods. One man, older with silver hair at his temples, walked directly up the porch steps. He didn't knock. He just stood there, waiting. Dante walked toward the front door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at Chloe. She was backed against the kitchen counter, clutching her empty coffee mug like it was a weapon. She felt incredibly small. "You saved my life, Chloe," Dante said. His voice was soft, carrying over the hum of the engines outside. "Just go," she whispered. "I always pay my debts." He looked around the shabby, drafty cabin. "I'll be in touch." "Don't," Dante smiled. It was a terrifying expression. He turned the knob and pulled the door open. The silver-haired man bowed his head slightly. "Boss, we secured the perimeter. The local PD has been redirected." "Good," Dante said, stepping out into the cold morning air. Chloe stood frozen as the men swarmed him, draping a heavy cashmere overcoat over his bare shoulders. They escorted him down the steps and into the back of the lead SUV. The doors slammed shut. The synchronized sound echoed like gunshots in the quiet woods. Slowly, methodically, the massive convoy began to reverse, maneuvering out of her driveway in a perfectly orchestrated retreat. Within 5 minutes, they were gone. The only proof they had ever been there were the deep, churning tire tracks left in the mud. Chloe stared out the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at her hands. There was still a faint smear of his blood on her left palm. She had wanted an ordinary life. But as the last black SUV disappeared into the fog, Chloe knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her ordinary life was over. Bleach was supposed to kill anything. It was supposed to erase bacteria, strip away color, and sanitize the foulest messes. But it couldn't erase the memory of Dante. Chloe scrubbed the living room floor until her knuckles bled. She used 2 bottles of industrial cleaner, a stiff bristled brush, and boiling water. The fake Persian rug was rolled up and shoved into the outdoor incinerator barrel, burning black smoke into the grey afternoon sky. Still, every time she walked past the entryway, her brain superimposed a bleeding man onto the clean linoleum. It took 3 days for the adrenaline to fully drain from her system. When it finally did, it left behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. She needed normalcy. She needed routine. On Thursday morning, Chloe put on her scrubs. She had traded the chaotic wail of the city ambulance for a quiet, mundane job, drawing blood and filing charts at a small urgent care clinic in town. It was boring. It was safe. It paid just enough to keep the lights on and the cabin heated. Her drive into town was uneventful. The dirt road had dried into deep, hard-packed ruts from the tires of 200 SUVs. Her old Ford pickup rattled violently over them, a physical reminder of the phantom army that had invaded her property. The clinic was slow. Old man Henderson came in for his cholesterol check. A teenager needed stitches after a skateboard accident. Chloe went through the motions, her hands steady, her bedside manner practiced and calm. At noon, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It wasn't a text. It was an automated alert from her bank. Chloe stepped into the break room, pouring a cup of stale drip coffee. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. Alert. Incoming wire transfer approved. She frowned, unlocking her banking app. The screen loaded. Chloe stopped breathing. Her checking account, which yesterday had held a precarious $214, now showed a balance of $500,000. She stared at the zeros. She counted them 3 times. A cold, sinking dread settled in her stomach. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a payoff. "I always pay my debts," Dante had said. She shoved the phone back into her pocket like it was radioactive. The coffee tasted like acid in her throat. She didn't want his money. Money like that didn't come without strings. It was blood money, tied to a world she had spent her entire adult life trying to avoid. She needed to send it back. She needed to march into the bank, demand they reverse the wire, and wash her hands of the man with the bruised steel eyes. Before she could form a plan, the heavy glass door of the clinic swung open. Sheriff Deputy Miller walked in. He was a thick-necked man who wore his uniform too tight and carried an unearned sense of authority. He didn't check in at the front desk. He walked straight past the waiting chairs and leaned his heavy forearms on the reception counter, looking directly at Chloe. "Morning, Chloe," Miller drawled, his eyes flicking over her scrubs. "Deputy," she replied, keeping her voice even. She set her coffee down. "Are you here for a flu shot? You missed the clinic last week." "Not today." Miller chewed on a toothpick, his gaze shifting to the closed door of the examination room, then back to her. "Actually, I'm doing a bit of neighborhood canvassing. We had some strange reports out your way a few nights ago. The night of the big storm." Chloe's heart performed a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She picked up a stack of patient files, tapping the edges against the desk to align them. "Strange how?" "Reports of vehicles, a lot of them, moving down County Road 9, right around the turnoff for your property." Miller stopped chewing the toothpick. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for a tell. "You didn't happen to hear anything out there, did you? Maybe see someone who didn't belong?" He knew. Or at the very least, he suspected. Miller was a dirty cop. The whole town knew it. If he was asking about Dante, he wasn't doing it to uphold the law. He was doing it for whoever had put that bullet in Dante's side. "I sleep with a white noise machine," Chloe said smoothly, meeting his gaze without blinking. "And the storm was loud. I didn't hear a thing." Miller held her stare for a long, uncomfortable moment. He didn't believe her. She could see the calculation behind his dull eyes, weighing the risk of pressing her further right there in the open clinic. "Right," Miller said finally. He stood up straight, adjusting his utility belt. The heavy brass of his gun holster clinked against the counter. "Well, if you do remember anything, you give me a call, directly on my cell. Lot of dangerous people passing through these parts lately. Wouldn't want a nice girl like you getting caught in the crossfire." It was a threat, thinly veiled and carelessly delivered. "I'll keep that in mind, Deputy." Miller tipped his hat and walked out. Chloe stood frozen behind the desk until the cruiser pulled out of the parking lot. Her hands were shaking again. She looked down at her pocket, where the phone with the $500,000 balance sat heavy against her thigh. Dante hadn't just paid a debt. He had painted a target on her back. By the time Chloe's shift ended at 6, the autumn sky had bruised into a deep, violent purple. She drove home with her doors locked, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. Every set of headlights that turned down her road made her breath catch. She needed a weapon. She had a heavy mag-light flashlight in the glove compartment and a hunting knife in her kitchen drawer. It felt pathetically inadequate. Her tires crunched over the gravel as she pulled into a driveway. The cabin was dark, exactly as she had left it. The woods were quiet. Chloe parked the truck and sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The paranoia was eating her alive. She was jumping at shadows. Miller was just fishing, she told herself. Nobody knew what had happened in her living room except her and Dante. She grabbed her bag and stepped out into the crisp evening air. She walked up the porch steps, her keys jingling in her hand. She stopped. The front door was off its latch, just an inch. The deadbolt housing hung loosely from the wood, splintered and mangled. Someone had taken a crowbar to it. Chloe didn't gasp. She didn't scream. Years in the back of an ambulance had trained her to compartmentalize panic. Her brain immediately shifted into a cold, clinical state of survival. She backed away slowly, easing her weight off the creaking porch boards. She needed to get back to the truck. "I wouldn't," a voice said from the darkness. A man stepped out from the side of the cabin, cutting off her path to the vehicle. He was tall, wearing a faded denim jacket and holding a suppressed pistol by his side. It looked unnaturally long and heavy in the dim light. Before Chloe could pivot toward the woods, the front door swung open. A second man stepped onto the porch. This one was built like a cinder block, his face scarred and his nose flattened from old brakes. "Get inside," the cinder block said. Chloe calculated the distance to the tree line. She wouldn't make it 3 steps before the man by the truck shot her in the back. Wordlessly, she turned and walked through her ruined front door. The inside of her cabin had been tossed. Her books were ripped from the shelves. Her sofa cushions were sliced open, yellow foam spilling onto the floor. The trauma kit she had hidden under the bathroom sink was sitting on the kitchen table, unzipped, the bloody shears from 3 nights ago resting on top. "You did a good job on the floor," the taller man said, following her inside and kicking the door shut. "Smells like a damn swimming pool in here, but you forgot to toss the trash." He gestured to the trauma kit. "I'm an EMT," Chloe said, keeping her voice level. "I keep medical supplies." "You're a liar," the big man grunted. He stepped close to her. He smelled like cheap stale tobacco and unwashed hair. "Miller said you were acting squirrely. He was right." "Where did he go, sweetheart?" "Who?" The back of his hand connected with her cheekbone before she even saw the swing. The force of the blow sent Chloe crashing into the wall. Her vision whited out for a second, a sharp ringing tone exploding in her left ear. She slid to the floor, tasting the warm, metallic tang of blood in her mouth. "Don't play stupid," the tall man said, stepping over her. He squatted down, resting the barrel of the suppressed gun against her knee. "We know Dante was here. He took a bullet from my partner. He should be dead, but he ain't. Which means someone patched him up. And since you're sitting here with bloody scissors and bleach on your hands, I'm guessing it was you." Chloe spit blood onto the floor. "I don't know who you're talking about," the man sighed. A dramatic, weary sound. "Wyatt, break her arm. Let's see if that jogs her memory." The big man, Wyatt, stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He reached down, grabbing Chloe by the collar of her scrubs, hoisting her upward like a rag doll. Chloe didn't freeze this time. She reached into her scrub pocket, her fingers closing around the heavy metal barrel of her favorite pen, a solid steel tactical pen she used to carry on night shifts in the city. As Wyatt lifted her, Chloe drove the point of the pen upward with all her strength, aiming for the soft tissue under his jaw. It connected. Wyatt roared, dropping her and staggering back, his hands flying to his neck. Blood spurted through his fingers. The tall man swore, raising the pistol. Before he could pull the trigger, the front window of the cabin shattered inward. A hail of glass rained over the living room. Through the broken frame, a man stepped into the house. He didn't scramble. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He wore a dark suit, his silver hair catching the dim light of the kitchen bulb. It was the older man from the porch. The one who had bowed to Dante. Leo. The tall man spun toward the window, bringing his gun up. Leo didn't hesitate. He raised a heavy black handgun and fired twice. The reports were deafening in the small enclosed space. The tall man's head snapped back, a mist of red painting the floral wallpaper behind him. He dropped like a stone. Wyatt, still clutching his bleeding neck, lunged at Leo with a desperate, animalistic cry. Leo simply sidestepped, grabbed the heavy fireplace poker from the hearth, and brought it down across the back of Wyatt's skull with a sickening crack. The big man crumpled to the floor, twitching once before going entirely still. Silence descended on the cabin, heavy and ringing. Chloe sat against the wall, her chest heaving, the steel pen still clutched in her shaking, bloody hand. Leo casually adjusted his cuffs. He looked at the two bodies on the floor, then turned his gaze to Chloe. His expression was entirely neutral, like a man assessing a minor plumbing leak. "Miss," Leo said politely, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "I apologize for the mess, but you need to pack a bag. We are leaving." Chloe stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who were they?" "An unfortunate consequence of your kindness," Leo replied, "and proof that this location is no longer secure." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Leo sighed. It was a gentle, almost grandfatherly sound. "My employer was very specific. If the Callahan Syndicate found you, I am to bring you to him, safely. I would prefer you walk out that door on your own 2 feet. But I will carry you if I must." Chloe looked at the dead man on her rug. She looked at the blood on the walls. Her quiet, ordinary life was gone, burned to ash in the span of 3 days. She let the pen drop to the floor. "Give me 5 minutes," she whispered. The ride took 3 hours. Chloe sat in the back of a heavily armored luxury sedan, the leather seats cold against her skin. Leo drove in absolute silence. A solid partition separated the front cab from the back, locking her in a quiet, climate-controlled vault. There were no interior door handles. She had checked. She watched the landscape shift from the dense, pine-covered hills of her rural county to the sprawling, manicured estates of the coastline. The roads became smoother, the streetlights more frequent. Eventually, the sedan turned off the main highway and approached a pair of massive wrought-iron gates set into a high stone wall. Cameras swiveled to track their approach. The gates swung open smoothly, revealing a sprawling compound that looked less like a home and more like a fortress disguised as a billionaire's retreat. The car glided up a long, sweeping driveway lined with ancient oak trees, finally coming to a stop in front of a sprawling modern mansion built of glass, steel, and dark stone. The door opened from the outside. Leo stood there, offering a hand. Chloe ignored it, stepping out into the cool night air. The smell of the ocean was heavy here, mixing with the scent of wet asphalt. Men in dark suits were stationed discreetly around the perimeter, their postures relaxed but vigilant. "This way," Leo instructed. He led her through a set of heavy double doors and into a foyer that looked like it belonged in a museum. The floors were polished marble, echoing sharply under Chloe's worn sneakers. The opulence was suffocating. Leo guided her down a long hallway, stopping in front of a pair of heavy mahogany doors. He opened one and gestured for her to enter. Chloe stepped inside. It was a library, vast and dimly lit by a massive stone fireplace crackling at the far end of the room. Bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes. The air smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and a faint hint of cedar cologne. At the center of the room, behind a massive oak desk, sat Dante. He looked different. He wasn't the broken, bleeding stray she had dragged out of the rain. He was dressed in a crisp black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the faded scars on his forearms. His dark hair was neatly styled, and the bruised steel eyes were sharp, calculating, and fully in command. He was reviewing a stack of documents, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting near his hand. He looked up as she entered. His gaze immediately locked onto the dark swelling bruise on her cheekbone. A muscle in his jaw feathered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Leo," Dante said, his voice dangerously soft. "You were supposed to get there before they touched her." "They moved quickly, boss. The local deputy tipped them off earlier than anticipated." "Ensure the deputy doesn't make any more phone calls," Dante commanded without looking away from Chloe. "Already handled," Leo murmured. bowing his head slightly before backing out of the room and closing the heavy doors behind him. The click of the latch echoed loudly. Chloe and Dante were alone. He stood up slowly. He moved with a slight stiffness, favoring his right side, but the agonizing vulnerability he had shown in her living room was entirely gone. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from her. Up close, the sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. He was a predator in his natural habitat. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a leather armchair near the fire. "I prefer to stand," Chloe replied, crossing her arms over her chest. "And I prefer to go home." Dante studied her face. He raised a hand, his fingers brushing the air inches from her bruised cheek. She flinched backward. He dropped his hand, his expression hardening. "You don't have a home anymore, Chloe," he stated. It wasn't a threat, it was a brutal fact. The Callahans sent cleaners. If Leo hadn't arrived, you would be buried in a shallow grave in the woods by morning. "Because of you," she snapped, her anger finally breaking through the shock. "Because you bled all over my porch. I didn't ask for this. I stitched you up. I kept my mouth shut, and you rewarded me by dumping $500,000 into my bank account and sending assassins to my door. The money was compensation. The men were a consequence. In my world, no good deed goes unpunished." Dante leaned against the edge of his desk, crossing his ankles. "I told you I pay my debts. Keeping you breathing is part of that. I don't want your protection. I want my life back." "Your life," Dante said, his tone mocking, was hiding in a drafty cabin, working a menial job to avoid dealing with the burnout of a failed medical career. It was a holding pattern. You were already dead, Chloe. You just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The accuracy of his words hit her like a physical blow. She clenched her jaw. "That's none of your business. It became my business the moment you opened that door. You saved the head of the largest syndicate on the East Coast. Did you really think you could just wash your hands and go back to drawing blood at a strip mall clinic?" He shook his head slowly. "The Callahans know who you are. They know what you look like. If you walk out of those gates, you belong to them. They will torture you to get to me, and then they will kill you." Chloe stared at him, the reality of her situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She looked around the massive, beautiful room. The books, the fire, the locked doors. "So, this is it?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I traded a cabin in the woods for a gilded cage." Dante stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. There was no warmth in his eyes, but there was a deep, burning intensity that terrified her more than the men with the guns. "It's a fortress," Dante corrected, his voice dropping to a low, rough murmur. "And you will stay inside it until I have dismantled the people hunting you. You will have everything you need. You will be protected. But you will not leave." "I am not a pet, Dante." A dark, dangerous smile touched the corner of his mouth. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. "I know," he whispered. "Pets don't drive steel pens through men's throats. You're something else entirely, Chloe. And until this is over, you belong to me." A week in the estate felt like a decade in a vacuum. Chloe mapped the perimeter with the cold, clinical precision she used to reserve for triaging multi-car pileups. The property was a masterpiece of paranoia. The cliffside dropped 200 feet into the churning Atlantic, eliminating any approach from the east. The north and south walls were 12-foot reinforced stone, capped with motion sensors rather than barbed wire, a subtle, expensive choice. 10 guards rotated on 12-hour shifts. They carried suppressed submachine guns under custom-tailored jackets. She was given a suite in the West Wing. It had a balcony she couldn't open, a television that only accessed pre-approved streaming services, and a king-sized bed that felt like a slab of marble. Every morning, a silent woman named Maria delivered espresso and fresh fruit. Every evening, Leo knocked on the door to inform her that dinner was ready in the main dining hall. Chloe attended every dinner. She refused to eat in her room. She refused to act like a prisoner, even if she was one. The dining hall was a cavernous room built of dark mahogany and low lighting. Dante sat at the head of a table built for 20, nursing a glass of bourbon. The meals were quiet, tense affairs. They didn't speak of the Callahans. They didn't speak of the men dead on her cabin floor. On the 8th night, Chloe pushed her plate of untouched sea bass away. The silver fork clattered loudly against the fine china. "If the strategy is to bore me to death, it's working," she said. Dante looked up from his tablet. He wore a simple grey sweater, the sleeves pushed up. The bruising around his jaw had faded to a dull yellow. He looked rested. Dangerous, but rested. "Safety is rarely entertaining, Chloe." "This isn't safety, it's sensory deprivation." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You took my phone. You took my clothes. I am wearing cashmere sweatpants that cost more than my truck. I don't want luxury. I want to know what is happening outside those gates. My people are dismantling the Callahan infrastructure. It is a slow, methodical process." He set the tablet down. "You don't need the details." "I killed a man with a pen because of those details," Chloe fired back, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I earned the right to know." Dante's eyes locked onto hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He picked up his bourbon, taking a slow sip. He didn't look angry. He looked assessing. "Stand up," he commanded softly. Chloe didn't move for a second. Then, fueled by a mixture of spite and genuine curiosity, she stood. Dante stood as well. He walked past her, his gait smooth, the limp barely noticeable now. "Come with me." He led her out of the dining hall, bypassing the grand staircase, and moved down a narrow, unadorned corridor at the back of the house. He pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner next to a heavy steel door. It clicked open with a pneumatic hiss. Chloe stepped inside. The room hummed with the sound of cooling fans. It was a command center. A massive digital map of the eastern seaboard dominated the far wall, dotted with red and green markers. 3 men wearing headsets sat at a bank of monitors, tracking shipping lanes, offshore accounts, and local police dispatch frequencies. This was the nerve center of Dante's empire. "Leave us," Dante said. The 3 men stood immediately, dropping their headsets on the desks, and filed out of the room without a single glance in Chloe's direction. The steel door hissed shut behind them. "You want the details," Dante said, walking over to the central console. He tapped a few keys. The main screen zoomed in on a detailed street map of the city's port district. "Declan Callahan runs his narcotics through Pier 42. 3 days ago, my men intercepted 2 of his shipments. We burned them in the containers. Yesterday, we compromised his union boss. He no longer controls the docks." Chloe stared at the red markers. It was organized, corporate. It stripped the messy reality of blood and bone away, turning violence into logistics. "And how did Declan react to that?" she asked, stepping closer to the screens. "He sent a crew to hit one of my front businesses in the garment district." Dante brought up a grainy security feed. It showed the aftermath of a firebombing. Blackened brick, shattered glass. 2 of my people died. Chloe looked at Dante. He was staring at the feed, his face a mask of absolute calm. But she saw the slight tightening of the muscles in his neck, the rigid set of his shoulders. "You're losing men," she said quietly. "It's the cost of doing business. The Callahans are desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. Declan is bleeding money. By the end of the week, his own lieutenants will turn on him to stop the financial hemorrhage. Then it ends. Just like that." Just like that. Dante turned to face her. The ambient blue light from the monitors cast sharp shadows across the planes of his face. "This is what you wanted to see, Chloe, the mechanics of survival. Does it make you feel better?" "No," she admitted, "but it makes me feel less blind." She looked at him, really looked at him. He was a king standing in a room built for war, but he was also a man who had nearly bled to death on her cheap rug. "Sit down," she said suddenly. Dante raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Your posture. You're favoring your right side again. You did it when you walked down the hall. Chloe pointed to a leather chair in the corner of the room. Sit. I want to look at the stitches. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse, the boss giving up authority in his own war room. But then, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched his lips. He walked over to the chair and sat down. He pulled the hem of his sweater up, exposing his torso. Chloe approached him. She didn't have her kit, but she didn't need it. She knelt on the carpet beside the chair, the cool air of the server room biting at her bare arms. She leaned in. The bandage was gone. The incision site was a neat, angry red line bisecting his pale skin, surrounded by a fading halo of yellow and purple bruising. The black threads she had sewn in desperation were holding perfectly. She reached out, her cool fingertips grazing the skin just outside the wound. Dante drew in a sharp breath. His abdominal muscles flexed, hard as stone under her touch. It's healing well, she murmured, pressing gently around the edges to check for heat or swelling. No signs of infection. You're lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it. You have steady hands. Chloe looked up. Their faces were inches apart. The cynical armor she wore, the cold detachment she used to survive the ambulances and the isolation, felt incredibly thin right now. She could smell the bourbon on his breath. She could see the dark, dilated centers of his eyes. Why did you really bring me here, Dante? She asked, her voice barely a breath. You have an army. You could have relocated me anywhere, a safe house, another country. You put me in your own home. Dante didn't answer immediately. He looked down at her, his gaze heavy, tracking the line of her jaw, the faint yellow bruise still marking her cheek. Slowly, he reached out. His hand cupped the side of her face. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, startlingly gentle for a man who ordered cities to burn. Because I trust very few things in this world, he said, his voice a low gravel. I trust the math on those screens. I trust Leo, and I trust the woman who looked at a dying man, knew he was dangerous, and opened the door anyway. He leaned forward. Chloe didn't pull back. The air between them vanished. The heavy steel door of the command center slammed open. Dante snapped his head up, his hand dropping from her face. Chloe scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Leo stood in the doorway. His impeccably tailored suit was immaculate, but his silver hair was disheveled. He held a suppressed pistol in his right hand. Boss, Leo said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual calm refinement. They bypassed the perimeter. The front gates are down. Dante was on his feet instantly. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by absolute chilling violence. He pulled a heavy Glock from the holster at the small of his back and racked the slide. How many? Dante demanded. 2 transport vans, at least 20 men. Heavily armed, Declan is leading them himself. Leo stepped fully into the room. They jammed the outgoing signals. We can't call for backup. It's just the house guard. Dante looked at Chloe. Stay in this room. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me or Leo. No, Chloe said, standing up. The fear was there, cold and sharp in her stomach, but beneath it was something harder. She was done hiding. You have 10 guards and Leo, against 20. I'm not sitting in a closet waiting to see who wins. You are unarmed and untrained, Dante snarled, grabbing her by the shoulders. You will stay here. I can stabilize trauma. I can pull a man back from arterial shock. She met his furious gaze without blinking. Your men are going to get shot, Dante. If they bleed out, you lose the house. Let me do my job. A massive explosion rocked the compound. The floor vibrated beneath their feet, and the digital map on the wall flickered before going completely black. The emergency backup generators kicked in, bathing the command center in a harsh, pulsing red light. The front doors had been breached. Dante stared at her in the bloody light. He didn't argue. He didn't have time. Leo, Dante barked. Get her a vest, and a med kit from the armory. The mansion was no longer a gilded cage. It was a war zone. The sound of automatic gunfire echoed through the sprawling hallways, a deafening, continuous roar that tore through the expensive plaster and shattered the imported glass. Cordite hung thick in the air, a bitter, choking smell that stung the back of Chloe's throat. She crouched behind a massive marble pillar in the main foyer. She wore a heavy Kevlar vest over her cashmere sweater. At her feet sat a black tactical trauma bag Leo had shoved into her hands. 30 feet away, the heavy oak front doors lay in splinters across the polished floor. Dante and Leo were positioned behind the overturned dining table in the adjacent room, laying down suppressive fire toward the entryway. The muzzle flashes strobe-lit the darkness. The Callahans were pushing hard. They weren't moving with tactical precision. They were moving with brute force, overwhelming the estate's defenders through sheer numbers. A young house guard, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22, was pinned down behind a leather sofa near the stairs. He leaned out to fire. A 3-round burst caught him in the shoulder and the thigh. He spun backward, crying out, and hit the floor hard. Chloe didn't think. The same instincts that had propelled her out of the back of an ambulance into chaotic gangland shootings took over. She grabbed the handle of the trauma bag and sprinted across the open floor. Bullets chewed into the marble behind her, spraying stone shrapnel against her calves. She slid on her knees behind the sofa, crashing into the wounded guard. "Keep your head down!" she yelled over the deafening noise. The kid was pale, clutching his thigh. Blood was pumping out in a terrifying rhythmic pulse, the femoral artery. "I'm going to die!" the kid gasped, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Not today!" Chloe snapped. She ripped the bag open. She bypassed the bandages. She didn't have time to be delicate. She grabbed a combat tourniquet, whipped it around his upper thigh high and tight, and cranked the windlass rod until the nylon bit savagely into his flesh. The kid screamed, thrashing against her. "Hold still!" Chloe put her knee squarely on his chest, pinning him down while she secured the rod. She looked at the wound. The pulsing had stopped. The bleeding was controlled. She turned her attention to his shoulder, a clean through and through. She packed it tightly with hemostatic gauze, her hands slick with his blood. A shadow fell over them. Chloe looked up. A man in a tactical vest wearing a ski mask had vaulted the sofa. He raised a short-barreled shotgun, aiming it directly at Chloe's face. Time slowed down to a crawl. She saw the man's finger tightening on the trigger. She saw the dirt on his boots. Before the hammer could drop, the man's head jerked violently to the side. A spray of red painted the wall above the stairs. He collapsed instantly, heavy and dead, dropping the shotgun onto the rug. Chloe looked toward the dining room. Dante stood entirely exposed, his Glock raised, smoke curling from the barrel. He had left cover to take the shot. "Move!" Dante roared, diving back behind the shattered table as incoming fire chewed up the space he had just occupied. Chloe grabbed the wounded guard by the collar of his tactical vest. "Use your good leg! Push!" Together, they dragged themselves backward, inching down the hallway away from the main foyer and toward the reinforced kitchen doors. The battle raged for another 20 minutes. It felt like hours. Chloe dragged 2 more men out of the line of fire. She bandaged a shattered arm, packed a chest wound, and applied pressure to a torn neck. She moved through the blood and the noise with a terrifying calm, a ghost flitting between the muzzle flashes. Gradually, the volume of fire from the entryway began to thin. The brute force assault was breaking against the disciplined defense of Dante's remaining men. Then silence fell. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a ringing, heavy pause, the sound of empty magazines hitting the floor, the wet coughs of dying men. Chloe sat slumped against the stainless steel island in the kitchen. Her hands were coated in blood, drying dark and tacky against her skin. The red emergency lights pulsed rhythmically. The kitchen doors swung open. Leo walked in. His suit was ruined, covered in plaster dust and blood that wasn't his own. He was limping heavily, but his face was an impassive mask. "Status?" Leo asked, looking at the three wounded men Chloe had dragged into the room. "They're stable. They need a hospital, Leo. They need surgery." Chloe wiped a streak of sweat and blood from her forehead. "Where is Dante?" Clearing the front lawn. Leo leaned against the counter, wincing slightly. "Declan Callahan is dead. The remaining men surrendered or fled. The perimeter is secure." Chloe let out a long, shuddering breath. She dropped her head back against the steel cabinet, closing her eyes. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving a cold, trembling void in its wake. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Dante walked into the kitchen. He was a terrifying sight. His face was smeared with soot and blood. His grey sweater was torn. The Glock hung loosely in his right hand. He surveyed the room, his eyes moving over the wounded men, lingering on the thick, slick pools of blood on the tile. Finally, his gaze found Chloe. He didn't speak. He walked across the room, grabbed her by the arm and pulled her to her feet. He didn't let go. He half led, half dragged her out of the kitchen, down the dark hallway and back toward the library. The heavy mahogany doors had survived the assault. Dante pushed them open and locked them behind him. The library was quiet. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Dante dropped his gun on the desk. He turned to her. The restraint, the calculated control he always maintained, was entirely gone. He crossed the room in 2 strides, backing her up against the heavy wooden bookshelves. He didn't speak. He brought his hands up, framing her face, his thumbs smearing the dried blood on her cheeks. His chest heaved, pressing against hers. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was violent, desperate, and tasting of ash and copper. It was the collision of 2 people who had just walked through a slaughterhouse and needed to prove to themselves that they were still alive. Chloe didn't hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his ruined sweater, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, answering hunger. She tasted the bourbon, the smoke, the sheer, undeniable reality of him. Her hands moved over his shoulders down his back, feeling the hard ridges of old scars beneath the fabric. She anchored herself to him, letting the cynical, isolated part of her mind shatter completely. Dante pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. They were both breathing hard. The silence of the library a stark contrast to the roar of the foyer. "You didn't hide," he whispered, his voice ragged. "I told you. I don't hide." Chloe looked up into the bruised steel eyes. "I saved your men." "You saved my men," he agreed. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "You are magnificent, Chloe, and entirely out of your mind." The cleanup took 3 days. Private contractors arrived in unmarked vans before dawn. They stripped the ruined marble, replaced the shattered doors, and scrubbed the blood from the stone. The bodies were removed with quiet efficiency. Dante's retaliation against the remnants of the Callahan syndicate was swift and merciless. With Declan dead, the organization fractured. Dante didn't negotiate. He absorbed their territory, executed their remaining lieutenants, and silenced the corrupt police deputies who had been on their payroll, including Deputy Miller, whose cruiser was found abandoned by the county line. The war was over. On the 4th morning, Chloe woke up in her suite in the West Wing. Sunlight streamed through the windows. The estate was quiet. She showered, watching the last faint tinges of yellow bruising wash away down the drain. She dressed in a simple pair of jeans and a black sweater. When she walked down to the library, the doors were open. Dante sat behind his desk. The room was pristine, smelling only of leather and old paper. He looked up as she entered. He looked composed, the violent king securely back upon his throne. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Chloe sat down. Dante opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. He slid it across the polished oak surface. "What is this?" Chloe asked, not touching it. "A new passport, a driver's license, the deed to a property in a quiet coastal town in Maine, fully paid for." Dante leaned back in his chair. his expression unreadable. The 500,000 is still in your account. The Callahans are gone. No one is looking for you. You are completely safe. Chloe stared at the envelope. It was everything she had demanded a week ago. Her freedom. Her out. "You're letting me go," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I promise to protect you. The threat is neutralized, your debt is paid, and mine is settled." Dante's voice was flat, devoid of the desperate heat they had shared in this very room nights ago. "You can walk out the front gates, Chloe. You can have your ordinary life back." Chloe looked at the manila envelope. She reached out and touched the edge of it. An ordinary life. She thought about the clinic, drawing blood for cholesterol tests, going home to an empty, silent cabin, listening to the rain and pretending she wasn't completely hollow inside. She looked at Dante. He was watching her hands. The tension in his shoulders betrayed the careful neutrality of his face. He was waiting. He was giving her the choice, but he was holding his breath. Chloe picked up the envelope. She weighed it in her hands. Then slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half. The thick paper ripped with a loud, tearing sound that echoed in the quiet library. She dropped the pieces onto the desk. Dante's eyes flicked from the ruined documents to her face. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. "I don't want to go to Maine, Dante," Chloe said, leaning forward. She rested her elbows on the desk, holding his gaze. "I spent 4 years trying to live an ordinary life. It was suffocating. I opened that door in the storm because I was dying of boredom. I stitched you up because I wanted to feel something real again." Dante stood up slowly. He placed his hands flat on the desk, leaning in toward her. "This life isn't a game, Chloe. It is blood. It is paranoia. It is looking over your shoulder until the day you die. It will ruin you." "I was already ruined," she countered, her voice steady, hard, and absolutely certain. "You told me that yourself. I'm not a pet, and I'm not a civilian anymore. I don't want to be protected from the dark. I want to stand in it." Dante stared at her. The bruised steel eyes searched her face for a trace of hesitation, for the romantic delusion that so many people carried into his world. He found none. He found only the cynical, calculating EMT who had looked at a dying mob boss and decided he was worth the risk. A slow, genuine smile finally broke across his face. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. He walked around the desk, stopping in front of her chair. He reached down, weaving his fingers through her hair, tilting her head back. "You understand," Dante murmured, his voice a dark promise, "that if you stay now, the gates lock from the inside. There is no second chance. You are mine, and this empire becomes yours to carry." "I understand," Chloe whispered. She reached up, her hands gripping his wrists, feeling the steady, strong pulse beneath his skin. "Give me the keys." He pulled her up out of the chair, kissing her not with desperation this time, but with the heavy, absolute finality of possession. The storm had passed. The ordinary life was dead, and from its ashes, a new queen had been crowned. And that is how Chloe traded her quiet cabin for an empire. What did you think of that ending? If you loved watching Chloe evolve from a cynical EMT to a queen standing side by side with Dante, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who can't get enough dark, action-packed Mafia romance. Who was your favorite character? Would you have stayed in the fortress or taken the passport to Maine? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next epic storytelling series.